The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or to view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
Okay. I'd like to, in this evening lecture, what I'd like to do is continue a bit to expand on and complicate and maybe also deepen this idea I've been suggesting to you that I'm labeling the Fedot principle, really a shorthand way of describing the immensely complex and, from an intellectual standpoint, a historical standpoint, immensely exciting and astonishing process whereby film went in an incredibly short time from being a mere novelty to being an embedded social formation in the United States and in other industrialized societies, and not just only an embedded social formation, becoming, by the end of the 1920s, one of the central media for the expression of art, an artistic medium, so that it went from being a mere novelty, from Fedot sneeze in 20 years or so, 25 years, to being a medium of astonishingly rich and complex narrative art. That progress is part of what I mean by the Fedot principle. And it might be helpful if I concretize that a little bit more by mentioning a bit more about what I mean about what I was implying or referring to when I spoke about that moment of imitation. Remember, I said that there were essentially that silent film, and incidentally, I take it as a model for the way in which most new media systems develop in culture. You can apply this same basic schema to other forms of popular entertainment, including, shocking as it may seem, Shakespeare's public theater. And I'll come back to the implications of that analogy. The idea that Shakespeare was the movie of his time, that Shakespeare's theater was the Hollywood studio system of the Elizabethan era, is a very complicated one. It's a very inspiring one. And it's complicated because it makes us reassess our inherited notions about what art is and where art comes from. And one of the subtexts in this course is precisely that. It has to do with what I call the enabling conditions of art. And I'll come back to that again as a theme again and again in the course. So part of what I mean by the Fedot principle is this roiling, complex, partly unpredictable process whereby an enlarging population, incredibly hungry for the novelties being produced by this new technology, create a kind of symbiotic relationship between the audience and the emerging medium, so that as the medium grows more complicated, in part because the audience, okay, after 5 or 10 or 15 visits to the Nickelodeon or to after the movies moved out of the penny arcades and began to take their own space, as some of you know, and as is recounted in our reading for these early weeks, the movies first moved out into what were called Nickelodeons, right? They were storefronts for the most part, in which admission was a nickel. That's why they were called Nickelodeons. And you sat in many of these on benches without backs next to strangers. You didn't have private seats, and you would sit in there and see a series of short films. But the fact that the Nickelodeons emerged so quickly is a mark of how popular film became, even in its relatively primitive early form. And then, of course, within a few years of the Nickelodeons appearing, what else began to happen? Theaters made specially for the showing of motion pictures that were longer than the early shorts, because film began to expand its length all through the period from 1910 through 1920, right? What's the great moment when the feature film is born in the United States? 1915. Who's the director? D.W. Griffith. What's the film? Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation. A very complicated example because its content is disturbing in some ways. It's a very reactionary and in some respects racist film. It absorbs and carries forward what we might think of as the racial prejudices that were very widespread in American society at the turn of the century, and especially in the South, from which Griffith himself was a Southerner and was born in the South. And his film was deeply influenced by a best-selling novel called The Klansman, which was a celebration of the Ku Klux Klan. And the Birth of a Nation. So the content of Birth of a Nation is very unsettling and disturbing. And even when it was first released to the public to great acclaim because it expanded the possibilities of movies in all kinds of ways. From a technical standpoint, it is an astonishingly important film. And from a content standpoint, it's a very disturbing film. It's a wonderful reminder of the fact that this progress I'm describing to you is not an unalloyed, triumphal story. Even as the movies became more technically complicated and more demanding and longer and more interested in character, they also nonetheless carried the lies and prejudices and hierarchic assumptions that were embedded in the society from which they arose. How could it be otherwise? Every media form does this. But it's important to make this point as a way of reminding us that the story we're telling is not, in some simple sense, just a kind of progress myth in which we're celebrating development and genius. We're identifying and locating something more complicated than that. The process whereby these cultural myths and these stories that are drawn from inherited older stories and from the lore of the society more broadly and more generally are transformed into this new medium, and they have a tremendous technical interest. But very often they also have a kind of cultural or sociological interest of a negative kind, in the sense that what they reveal are the prejudices, the lies, the limitations of the society that's given, the mythologies that sustain the society. Again, this is a matter to which we'll return. One of the deep cultural functions of American movies especially was to promulgate a kind of mythology of America. And we'll talk more about this when we reach certain genre forms in the second segment of the course. I said something earlier this morning that I want to make explicit because I think it's another way of qualifying this triumphal story. It's hard because I'm enthusiastic about what I'm looking at, and there is some material that's so exciting here to watch. In a way, what we're watching is we're watching the birth of the movies. We're watching the discovery of the language of cinema in these early films. And that's why, even though from an artistic standpoint some of these shorts are not very rich, I hope they're interesting enough that I've made them interesting to you from a historical standpoint. If you look at them closely, you can see the movies being born. You can see a language, a syntax for speaking in pictures, for this new visual language, this new visual medium being developed. And if I have time this evening, I'll give you a few more concrete examples of that. But another way in which one can qualify this apparently triumphal story, it's not a triumphal story, even though it is a story of refinement, development, and evolution of a kind that involves increasing complexity and technical perfection, technical mastery. It's not merely that, or not even primarily that. It's very important to recognize, among other things, as I implied this afternoon, that not all the possibilities that are inherent in the nascent medium are necessarily exploited in a particular cultural moment, or maybe ever exploited, depending on how things develop. That is to say, I mentioned this afternoon how, for instance, when Edison first conceived the apparatus, before it was actually invented, of the motion picture projector and the motion picture camera, his first idea was that he would create an item that would be a consumer item, what we would today call a consumer item, that would be sold to individual families, and the film would become, an equivalent of a kind of a photo album, although it would have motion in it. And as I suggested this afternoon, there's no reason why, given the nature of the technology itself, that vision of how film might develop was impossible. In fact, it wasn't impossible. It was just incredibly ahead of its time. It took a half a century before something like that actually became available in society. But there was no reason, in terms of the possibilities of the technology, that needed to happen. What I'm calling your attention to is what is a very widespread myth. It's especially pernicious and widespread at MIT. And it's very, for reasons that are obvious and understandable. We at MIT love to believe that technology will solve all problems. The truth of the matter is technology doesn't solve problems. It solves some problems, but it creates an equal number of new problems at a minimum. The fact of the matter is that it is not merely the case that technology by itself is never a solution to any social or political problem, even though it may be a potential instrument for certain kinds of social or political outcomes, but only a potential one. The technology will always, all new technologies will contain latencies, possibilities that are not exploited. Roads not taken by the technology. And we have some very interesting alternative possibilities. I'll give you one really scary one. Think about the way movies actually developed in the United States. That basic pattern with certain significant variations held pretty much in other societies as well. Even in an odd way, in societies where the production process was controlled more by government than it was by private enterprise. There was still a system in which audiences who were amateurs would go to a theater, collect in the theater, to watch a product that was made by a professional elite. And again, there's nothing in the technology that requires that, right? Well, what explains it? What explains it are the economic, demographic, social circumstances of the society at the moment when that technology became partly viable. So the choices that are made for how a technology will be used are always narrowing ones. You all have experience with this process. Think of, for example, the way cell phones have changed. And the way, or in fact, it's an interesting thing because all of you have been alive in the period when cell phones essentially came into society and were elaborated. Is there anyone here who can remember cannot remember a time before cell phones? See, all of you remember that, right? Well, you can think of what happened to you can think of the elaboration and the development of cell phones as a kind of, in some sense, perverse model for what I'm talking about. I say perverse because you can see how counterproductive, in many ways, some of the technological add-ons that are being created for cell phones are. It's as if the industry, insofar as it's a single industry, can't exactly figure out what to do because the audience for what we call the cell phone is such a diverse one, and illiterate teenagers love to text message, right? So even though it's not in the English language anymore, you can see the cell phone companies trying to teach the population how to speak in text message, right? In text message. Or whatever you would say, right? Have you ever seen the stupid ad in which you see the old grandmother trying to say, what does she say? She says, mind your own business in text speak. What would she, MYOB, she says to her daughter, as if grandmothers are going to begin to start texting. And of course, if you think about it from a technological standpoint, it's actually a very inefficient use of the medium, isn't it? Think how hard it is to type messages of any kind on cell phones. What inadequate environments they are for that. And what one could say is that certain kinds of decisions are being made that don't really have to do with the uses to which you might put this tiny little device, but have to do with the fact that there are so many latent possibilities in the digital technology that people are playing that manufacturers are trying out a whole range of things, some of which will definitely fall by the wayside, will disappear. And in fact, I guess many of you may not know this, but in the 1930s, the American AT&T, which then was the main telephone company in the society, decided that, of course, what was needed more than anything else was a picture phone. And they invested millions and millions of dollars in something called a picture phone, and they tried to market it. There were elaborate marketing campaigns. It didn't occur to them that, when people are on the telephone, they often don't want to be seen. Right? Because it was technologically possible to create a telephone that showed a person's features remember, this was a time when all phones were tethered to a line, so you couldn't walk around and take pictures outside. The camera in the cell phone is a more interesting device because the cell phone itself is portable and it allows you to do certain kinds of things. And in fact, the uses to which the cell phone camera is being put certainly are much more complicated now than they were when the people who decided to put cameras in cell phones could have imagined, right? It's an example of how the audience begins to take the new technology and find new uses for possibilities that are embedded in the technology. But to come back to the primary point is that every technology will have latent possibilities that are not exploited. And the reasons that they're not exploited do not necessarily have to do with intellectual or artistic questions or the best way to deploy this technology for the social good. The reasons have to do with market possibilities. The American market is so diverse that one of the things it encourages is an immense amount of duplication, overlap, and unnecessary competition in which different technologies which perform the same function are at war with each other all the time. We now have a new one having to do with high definition movies and television, right? And there are competing systems, right? Now the reason there are competing systems doesn't have to do with what's best for the consumer. It has to do with the fact of market. And so one of the things I'm suggesting to you, the primary thing I'm suggesting to you is that the evolution of the movies that I want you to be aware of, this process of increasing complexity and compression in which the movies become a more and more independent form of expression, in which the movies begin to discover the unique characteristics of the motion picture camera and of the environment of the movie theater. That the movies begin to explore those qualities in this new medium that are unique and special. That process is important, and I want you to be aware of it, but I don't want you to embrace that principle too uncritically, because I want you to recognize that the technology itself does not explain this process. The process is explained by cultural factors and social factors, and even sometimes individual psychological factors, right? What we're talking about here is the myth of technological determinism, the myth that technology drives culture, the myth that a new invention obliterates old inventions. The truth is much more complicated than that. In fact, even when new technologies come into a society and are successfully embedded in the social practices of a society, very different from the new technology becoming available, right? And you can all think in your own lifetimes of certain technologies that are no longer around. Any of you remember 8-track tapes that they used to have in cars? Some of you are nodding, right? You can't find them anymore. But in fact, think about what's happened just to computers. I mean, some of you must have old floppies that you can't use in your computers anymore. I still have an old computer that didn't have floppies, that had a 256 kilobyte hard drive, and that was the machine. That was the first IBM machine. So everything, and what they gave it to you with these giant, big, real floppies. That's why they were called floppies. They were you could bend them, you could, and that's become obsolete very quickly as well. So there's a principle of obsolescence that's built into the process as well. But the primary point is the myth of technological determinism reminds us that it is not technological discoveries themselves that explain why a particular technology becomes an embedded social form. That has to do with the culture and the historical circumstances of the society in which the technology is embedded. One of the most remarkable things about this evolutionary process I've been describing, as I said earlier, is how swift it is, how fast it is, how we go from being a mere novelty to becoming a significant social form by 1910 or so, and to becoming a virtually universal aesthetic and entertainment experience for the majority of the population in the country by 1920. So in something like 20 or 25 years, the movies go from being an absolutely unknown or trivial novelty, sharing space with fortune tellers and strip shows in the penny arcades, to becoming not just an embedded social form, but one of the dominant economic engines of the society, employing tens of thousands of people in various direct and ancillary positions, and mobilizing virtually the entire population of the country in a regular, routine, and habitual experience to which they return again and again. And because the audience is returning again and again, I said there's a kind of symbiotic relation between the audience and because the audience is returning again and again, what happens? That's also an aspect of the resources that are available to the medium. What begins then to develop are forms of storytelling that rely on the audience's prior memory of other shows, right? So that one thing that emerges very quickly is what we might call a star system. in which particular actors become identified with particular kinds of roles, and audiences want to come back to see those stars again and again. What also begins to happen is the establishment of a very rigorous kind of genre system. What's a genre? A category of story. The Western is a genre. The detective story is a genre. The elegy is a poetic genre, right? So genres, and the movies, the fundamental movie genres begin to emerge relatively early. There's a Western adventure story. There's a historical spectacle. There are certain forms of urban crime narrative that became our detective and crime films at a later stage. And there emerge especially certain forms of satire and comedy. So a genre system begins to emerge as well. And there are reasons, of course, why this kind of thing is useful to a mass production system, to a system, an assembly line system. Because, look, if you make 7 Westerns, if the same movie studio makes 7 Westerns, they can use the same horses again and again. They can use the same set. They can use the same hats. They might even be, and this in fact happened, they might even be able to use the same clip of film that shows a cattle stampede in 7 different movies because nobody would actually see it. So economies of scale become possible as the system begins to regularize itself once it stabilizes after that period of imitation and patent warfare, right? So one of the things, and there's nothing noble or artistic or conscious about this development. That's part of what makes it so remarkable. And it puts us in touch with a paradox that's at the very heart of what I hope to make you aware of in this course. It's a paradox that I guess it animates my transition many years ago now from a traditional literary scholar into someone interested in film and media. And it's this paradox, that based on what I've been telling you about this evolution of the medium, of the film medium. It's the paradox that capitalist greed, the crassest of alliances between commerce and modern technology, might be the enabling conditions of a complex narrative art. Right? Where does art come from? It's not just about art, though, even about sort of social, even if we forget the question of art and just talk about sort of the social and cultural importance of movie-going in modern societies. Leave out the question of whether it's an aesthetically valuable experience. It's so central to human experience, remains so central to human experience, that there's a tremendous paradox in this, that the crassest of alliances between commerce and technology, right? Nothing noble or admirable about it. Nobody's sitting down thinking, I want to make a new great medium for art. Nonetheless, this alliance becomes the enabling conditions for a complex form of social experience and of narrative art. Well, that paradox is at the heart of a lot of what we'll be looking at in this course, and I hope you'll keep it in mind as we go on. I'd like to say a couple of words, not too many, a couple of words about the Great Train Robbery, the very first film that you've seen. The Great Train Robbery is discussed in some helpful detail in David Cook's History of Narrative Film, and I urge you to look closely at his account of it. But I want to remind you about a couple of highlights. One is that although the Great Train Robbery seems very primitive to us, it's important to realize that even the Great Train Robbery is already a refined text. Most of the most fundamental principles of what we might call the syntax or grammar of the movies is already embedded in the Great Train Robbery. And what that means is that the 5 or 6 year period before that, when there is all this practice with non-narrative forms, lies behind the Great Train Robbery in some. And what also lies behind the Great Train Robbery is this experience of audiences going in first to the penny arcades, then to the Nickelodeons that begin to open up by the turn of the 20th century, and becoming impatient with repeated scenes that simply show jokes, hoses going off in people's faces or trains coming into a station. After a while, the novelty wears off. The audience wants more. But of course, the people who are making films are also interested in what they're doing. You can feel, especially if you look at D.W. Griffith's shorts, and you will have looked at 2 of them in this course, A Beast at Bay from last time, and the Lonedale Operator, which you'll see tonight before we turn to the Keaton films. And you'll see, these are just a sampling of his early work. But if you look closely at those, where you can feel Griffith's own excitement at discovering the possibilities of the cinema. In many cases, these films, Griffith is doing some things with the camera, doing some things with narrative shape, with the shaping of narrative in cinema that had never been done before. And you can feel his own excitement at the possibilities of this astonishing technology. Well, the Great Train Robbery, the most important discovery that the Great Train Robbery shows us, and again, it seems so obvious and so embedded that we wouldn't even think about it today. We've absorbed these principles so deeply into our DNA that we don't even think of. We learn how to watch movies in this way from the cradle in some ways, because by the time most people today are 5 or 6 years old, they've been subjected probably to more audiovisual images than anyone alive in 1900. And that's, we're just cognitively different in terms of our capacity to process audiovisual information. But imagine an audience that's completely illiterate in these things, that has to learn this system as the system itself is evolving. That's part of the excitement of looking at these early films. And the most important discovery in the Great Train Robbery is the discovery that the shot, the single uncut shot of film, however long it lasts, and its length is dependent on the decision you make about when to edit it, right? So it can go on for a long time, or it can be very short, and the length or the shortness of cuts also affects sort of the rhythm of your experience in the film. This is something that you can see Griffith practicing with even as early as A Beast at Bay. If you think about the great climax of The Beast at Bay, where you have the woman being threatened, but you also have this sort of race in the automobile to try to get there on time, and then the race to rescue her by a variety of people. What Griffith does is he cuts back and forth. He creates the principle of parallel action. What he discovered was that the audience will recognize this kind of cutting as showing you simultaneity, showing you things that are going on at the same time. And it was what he discovered were, in a certain sense, how the mind, how we would cognitively process certain kinds of gestures on film. And what he discovered, of course, is that if he edits more quickly, if he creates a fast rhythm, he creates excitement. And what he began to discover was something that later directors like Hitchcock would carry to an almost evil pitch, a capacity to manipulate and control the audience's reaction by the speed with which particular images appear or disappear. So Griffith, even at this early stage, you can see Griffith discovering important principles. The most fundamental principle in A Great Train Robbery, which is not a Griffith film, but precedes Griffith, is the discovery that the shot is the basic unit of action. Why is that a great discovery? Well, if you think of the movies as a device or as a medium that grows out of especially a theatrical dispensation, grows out of other things as well. Novels feed into it, visual art feeds into the movies. But it's certainly true that most of the major sort of ways in which directors first conceived how to think about the experience of what the camera is looking at, they would have been influenced by their own experience of theater. And if you think about it for a moment, what you can see, even in The Great Train Robbery, and an impulse to treat the camera as a stable thing. The camera doesn't move very much. There are panning shots in which the camera will go like this, right? But the camera will not track. It will not move back and forth or sideways in The Great Train Robbery. That's a discovery that Griffith is going to make and will exploit. And you can see it in A Beast at Bay. But in The Great Train Robbery, we haven't got that far yet. But what we have discovered, what Edwin Porter did discover, was that the shot is the basic unit of action. And what this means is, it's not simply what the camera sees, but then how the shots are edited afterwards that is so crucial. So what it came to understand was that the making of any movie is always a two-stage process. There's the shooting of the film, and then there's the editing of the film, right? And that itself is a fundamental discovery. But the idea that the shot is the unit of action instead of the scene was hard for movie makers to get, and what they would do, they would set the camera up, and then actors would walk in front of the camera. They would do what they had to do, and they would walk off. What's going on there? They're conceiving of cinematic space in theatrical terms. As soon as the camera is liberated, taken off its tripod, moved around in some way, allowed to back up or come close, even allowed to move laterally, what we're beginning to do is to explore more systematically what the camera's unique features are, how the theater is different from the movies, how certain effects are possible in the movies that would not be possible in the theater. When you watch the Keaton films that you're going to see tonight, watch for the ways in which Keaton repeatedly sets up situations such that when you see a particular gag of his, a joke, what you realize is that the joke could not have happened in the theater. It could not have been told to you verbally. The joke is visual. The joke involves motion. The joke involves a recognition of the powers of cinematic representation to tell stories. And you'll see many examples of this in the Keaton materials that you'll be looking at tonight. So one of the very first discoveries that's made is the discovery that the shot is the basic unit of action. A second discovery is the recognition that you have to cut between scenes. You do your editing between shots rather than, mostly what you do is you let scenes play out, even though you might abruptly cut a scene before the action is completed. That's another discovery that was made. If you cut the scene, if a person starts to walk toward the door, the earliest films, they would show the person walking all the way to the end, walking out of the door. Then filmmakers discovered, wait a minute, there's a way of creating a kind of quickness here, because if I show Thorburn walking toward the door, starting, and I cut, and he knocks his glasses off, and then I cut and I wait till he gets to the door and we see him leaving the door, I don't have to watch him take those 17 steps. Right? So what's been discovered is a basic principle of cinematic syntax, right? But it seems so obvious to us, but of course it's really a great discovery. In other words, the properties of the medium have to be understood before you can really begin to exploit it. And that's why I've asked you to look at some of these short films. None of the short films I've shown you are completely without some technical interest, and even though, of course, they're the only films I'm showing you that I wouldn't sort of make arguments to defend them as works of art, but I certainly would make arguments for them as technically fascinating documents, and I hope you'll look at them in that light. So the shot as a basic unit of action, cutting between scenes, and a couple of other things that I think are important in the Great Train Robbery. One is that you can see in the Great Train Robbery they're beginning to discover the value of camera placement. What happens when you place the camera in a particular position? That if the camera, especially if action is coming toward the camera, that you might not want to place the camera directly in front of the action that's coming toward you, that something happens if you place it slightly athwart it so it can see it at a slight angle. It creates a greater illusion of depth in the image, for example. And it does other kinds of things. It lets the action get closer to you before the scene has to be cut. So camera placement is something that you can see is beginning to be learned, beginning to be mastered in the Great Train Robbery, and camera position. So there are other things, and finally, one might mention one other thing that again establishes a principle that then continues in use for 50 or 75 years, and that's the principle of the process shot. You can see in the Great Train Robbery that some effects have been created by tricks. That there's back projection used in that. It looks crude to us, we can see through it, but the early audiences would not have recognized that. We're so used to location filming that we can pick out, we today can see through the process shots of earlier films. This in fact damages some of Hitchcock's films very badly today, because Hitchcock used a lot of process shot effects in his films. When he made them, the audiences were used to them. It was a convention of film going. Today, everything, because cameras are so much more mobile and light, and so much has been learned about how to, even about filming in low light and so forth, that there's much less use of process shots. So a new kind of process shot, I suppose, is emerging with digital animation. And one could say it's sort of a return to the idea of manipulating the image in illegitimate ways. But we can see, even in the Great Train Robbery, we can even see the beginnings of the use of process shots, of recognizing that you can create effects in the movies that are unique and special, that no other medium would allow you to do. And what's embedded there is science fiction. What's embedded there are all the kinds of imaginative, not just science fiction, all the kinds of imaginative movies that have been made that maybe take you inside people's nightmares or dreams, where what the film is showing you now, in other words, what is embedded in that process shot, even more fully embedded in Méliès, the French director's films like Trip to the Moon, where he explicitly goes into a realm of fantasy. is not only that the film is the most profoundly realistic medium that was ever invented, it may also be the most expressive medium for the rendering of non-realistic states, of dream, of nightmare, of fantasy, exactly because of the freedom that the film medium allows. And even these implications are at least embedded in the use of the process shots in Porter's The Great Train Robbery. The other short that you're going to see tonight that is not by Keaton is called The Lonedale Operator. It was made in 1911, in a way, it's the most advanced film of its time, and that's one reason. And what I hope when you look at it, you'll watch especially for how much more complex it is than, let's say, The Great Train Robbery, and it'll be a kind of small measure of this Fedot principle that I've been talking about. Let me mention a couple of things about the Lonedale Operator. Between 1907 and 1911, most films consisted of no more than 24 separate shots, right? Between 1908 and 1913, led by D.W. Griffith and his company, the Biograph Company, many more shots were introduced into a single reel of film. And in the Lonedale Operator, there are 98 shots, 6 intertitles, 1 main title, and 2 written inserts, all within a 17-minute length. Now think of just the advent of the access of complexity that has occurred just in less than 10 years, right? It's such a complicated film that one of the things we realize, even looking at it, if we look closely, is that it actually required a kind of attentiveness that earlier films did not. As filmmakers began to make these things and began to make them longer and began to make them more complicated, they realized that they couldn't just bring the camera out and start shooting. They began to develop the formal rationalizing strategies that led to the making of movies as we understand them. There was a 4-day shooting schedule created for the Lonedale Operator. It was one of the first films to have this format, and of course it's the format that is followed today with virtually every film in different aspects. And this also required a pre-planned shooting script. They had to plan what they would pre-plan all of their shooting, all of their shots, all of their camera angles. They needed a shooting script, a written script. Films didn't have written scripts at first, but Lonedale did. And it also required, in order for them to make their schedule, out-of-order shooting. That is to say, they had to shoot certain things not in the sequential order of the film. And that's one of the most basic principles of filmmaking, because once you set up the camera for a shot of a particular environment, if that environment shows up later in the film, it's unbelievably more expensive and time-consuming to reconstitute that whole set. So almost all films to this very day are still shot out of sequence in order to maximize the time you have in order to work at your most efficient. In other words, it's not an efficient way to make a movie to shoot it sequentially, to follow the script in its chronological sequence. And the Lonedale Operator is is maybe the first film to have all of these features that we would associate with a modern or a contemporary film. You might notice it's an immensely complex film, even in terms of its content, and I might leave that, I won't talk about that much now, except to say this. Watch the way in which the film tries to deal with what we might call hierarchies of gender. I mean, the film is partly about how a woman takes on a man's job. I mean, I guess it's her father, isn't it? Yeah. Her father is ill, and she has to take over running the train station, and she runs in. And so there's a certain sense in which one of the things that's dramatized socially is a woman sort of moving into a kind of masculine realm, taking on a role that's more aggressive than is appropriate for the gender ideologies that are dominant at the end of the 19th century in the United States. But the film is pretty clever about this, like many such popular texts, because although it does grant this woman a certain kind of masculine authority and competence, it also has other things in the film that balance that remind us that she is still nonetheless a weak vessel, that she is still a damsel in distress like the typical Victorian construction of women. In other words, what you can see is that the movie exhibits an anxiety about gender roles that's also an anxiety that's resident in the society itself. And I won't talk more about this now. It's something we will develop this aspect of the movies as a reflection of social anxieties and social problems as the course goes on. But I do want to call your attention to certain technical things that you can watch to at least one technical item in the film. It contains what might be called rhyming scenes, in which at one point in the film you'll see a sequence of scenes in a particular shot, and then later in the film almost exactly the same shot will reappear. And the effect of this, of course, is to create a sense of coherence and a sense of familiarity in the audience. It's actually a very subtle and careful strategy that Griffith himself devised. It creates a kind of continuity and clarity to the whole film. Watch, for example, how the doorway to the Lonedale station is photographed when you first see it. How this image anchors the film's spatial relationships. And how the film has a certain trajectory of movement that is repeated as the film goes on. So that, for example, early in the film, we see the heroine go from the exterior to the interior of the ticket office, and then to the inner office of the telegraph operator. And we see her do this, right? And then this sets up a kind of basic location and basic action for the entire film. It's as if what happens in that moment sets up, creates a familiarity for the audience with the sort of geography of the movie, because a lot of the action then will depend on our understanding of that geography. And then there are at least 4 different times that Griffith repeats that basic 3-shot trajectory from the exterior to the interior of the ticket office, and thence from the inner to the inner office of the telegraph operator. It happens 4 times in the film. So the film has a kind of visual coherence. By the time you come to it the 3rd or 4th time, it's as if you're intimate with the physical geography of the movie. This is actually a structural feature that it's easy to miss it, but it's actually very artful, and we can see it's a mark of how far film has come, even by 1911, that this level of attentiveness is available to us in the film. There's much more that could be said about the Lonedale Operator, but I will leave it to your intelligence and your attentiveness to try to pick out more things. And again, we're only talking about a 17-minute film. Well, Buster Keaton's career could be said in some degree to enact in small the larger processes I've been describing. He comes into film late, and in fact, if we were working perfectly chronologically in terms of when Chaplin became a director, he would precede Keaton. But I've organized the film according to the dates of the feature films, and the general is a decade earlier than Modern Times, which is the last, quote, silent film. It's not really a silent film, but it's the last silent film in a deep sense that was ever made. It was made in the sound era in 1936. And next week we'll talk more about the implications of that and why that was a very daring thing for Chaplin to do. Something like almost a decade after the advent of sound, he made a movie that essentially had no dialogue in it and that recalled the silent film. And everyone predicted that the film would be a flop, that Chaplin was, but of course they underestimated the affection and deep, intimate regard in which the population of the world held the Charlie Chaplin tramp character, who by now was an icon more widely known in the world than any person in previous history, I think, even more than Alexander the Great or any prior figure. Charlie Chaplin was the first global movie star. Was known virtually all over the world by the time he came to make Modern Times. So Keaton came a little later, comes into movie making after a few years after Chaplon, but his career has a similar trajectory. He began his career in legitimate theater, in vaudeville, and on the performance circuit, and was an acrobat from a very young age, from the age of 2 or 3, was in his parents' stage act. He was actually, and in fact, he learned a lot of his acrobatic feats on his parents' stage act. One very famous passage in his father used to take him, he was just a young kid, 3 or 4 years old, 5 years old, would take him by the legs and swing him back and forth like this. He had very long hair, and he would sweep the floor with his hair, and then swing him 2 or 3 times. This would happen live. He would swing him like this and let him go. And the kid, 5 years old, would fly against the wall and fall down. It would look terrible. And Keaton, later in his life, Keaton talked about this. There were actually some cities in which the societies for the prevention of cruelty to children came in and shut down the act, wouldn't allow the act to go on. Not stupid, because his father was a drunkard and sometimes performed drunk. And Keaton was sometimes injured He was also injured when he made his own movies because he was such a daring acrobat. Keaton recounts that when he first began to perform in this, he would make faces, faces that indicated pain or happiness or relief when his father was manipulating him this way. But he found that the audience responded much more comically, much more immediately, if he just kept his face expressionless. And that's where there developed the probably mistaken label for Keaton of the great stone face. And in his films, very often, you'll see this young man facing monumental catastrophe. His face will look out at things without ever changing expression. And there is something kind of comical about that. You'll see some examples of this in the general. Well, you'll see in the 2 short films that Keaton began to make that he enters film at already a relatively sophisticated time. And the shorts I'm asking you to look at are very interesting, remarkable films in their own way. And one of the things they teach us, and one of the reasons I want you to look closely at Keaton, is they show us yet again another aspect of what I mean when I talk about the Fedot principle, this development of evolution and increasing complexity. Because if you look at Cops, or if you look at 1 Week, what you will see Keaton doing in those films is learning how to link jokes together in some sort of a coherent way. But the films, and there are wonderful coherent sequences in these films, but still one doesn't feel that there's a real character in them, that there's a sustained, coherent fictional universe being dramatized. Maybe in Cops one does feel this. There's much more sort of textural coherence in Cops. But what we can see Keaton doing is beginning to move from the idea of a single joke to a sequence of jokes. And then, by the time we get to the general, moving from a single joke to a sequence of jokes to a sustained narrative which incorporates within it various kinds of comical jokes and also sequence jokes, because Keaton's best jokes are not single jokes at all, not one-liners, but the joke will be told again and again, or really what will happen is he will do something and you'll think, how could, and then the next step will top what he's done before, and the next step will top, you think that he got to a point where it would be impossible to add another comic complication to what he's done when he, of course, does it. And this becomes one of the deep principles of Keaton's comedy. There are numerous examples of it in both the 2 shorts and in the longer film the General. But let me mention an example from the General. Very early in the General, there's a sequence, it's probably the quintessential Keaton sequence, and I won't go into such detail as to spoil the film for you. But let me just say it involves a cannon, and it involves Keaton, who's chasing after. Keaton plays the engineer of a locomotive engineer. The general of the title is not a military general, it's a locomotive. The locomotive is called the general. And the film recounts a historically true story of a time when the Union Army came in, the Confederate Army, the Union Army came into Confederate territory and stole a locomotive belonging to the Confederacy, and Keaton, in a comic vein, retells this story. When you watch this cannon sequence, you'll see exactly what I mean. And this sequence is at the heart of James Agee's essay on the silent film comedy. And when you read that essay, you'll see even more clearly what I mean by a trajectory joke or a sequence joke, which builds and builds and builds and keeps topping itself. Well, this cannon sequence is a perfect example of that. And it's a perfect example of it not only because we see the joke getting more complicated as it goes on, but as the joke becomes more complicated, something else happens. The joke becomes more than a joke. It becomes a kind of comment on experience. It becomes a kind of comment on what life is like. That is to say, we move from something that simply makes us smile to something that makes us think about the world, that comments on the world, that imagines the world in a coherent way. I'll try to be more explicit about this in a moment. So in Keaton's career, we see him doing astonishing things as an acrobat, and we would admire him just for his acrobatic performances in these films. Watch in this film, in the General, for example, the way in which when he's piloting his locomotive, chasing the people who have stolen his original locomotive, how he's the only one on the train. And he crawls all over the train. Almost while the train is running, he'll crawl up to the front of it. He'll run to the back of it to put more fuel in. What you can see is, and also you can see this stuff really happening. It's not faked in any way, because there is a camera following the train as it's moving. You can see it's really moving because you can see it moving on the track, and you can see the world behind it, and you can tell that Keaton is not faking these effects. Well, this cannon sequence is a sublimely rich example of this complex process I've been describing. And it has to do in part with what I call the multiplicity principle, which I will define in a moment. So we see Keaton as an actor, as an acrobat actor, as a man much more than Chaplin, interested in the technology of motion pictures and of cinema. And you'll see a couple of examples in the films you're going to look at tonight in which we see Keaton exploring in a somewhat systematic way the nature of the illusion of the motion pictures. There's one remarkable moment, comical moment in 1 week, in which the heroine gets into a bathtub. And it looks like and she's sitting in the bathtub, she's starting to get up, and it looks like you're actually about to see some unmentionable parts of her body. And just as that's about to happen, a hand comes in front of the camera and blocks you. And it's actually a very disturbing moment in a way, because it interrupts the narrative flow. It's an intervention from the outside. Whose hand it is? It's not a character in the film. It's the director or something, right? It's a very bold moment, because what it does is it reminds you of the film as an artifact. It reminds you that the film is an artifact. In other words, it's a moment of self-reflexiveness or self-consciousness that you would never see in a Chaplin film, but shows Keaton's astonishing interest in the technology of motion pictures. I had many examples that Greg and I had ready, but I don't have time to show them to you. Maybe you can put up, while I'm talking, the Playhouse. One of his most famous examples of this is a film called The Playhouse, in which he ends up playing every role in the movie. And the way he did this was incredibly interesting. He would shoot the film, and then he would shoot the film, but he put masking tape over the lens of the camera, and only one little tiny part of the lens of the camera would expose the film, and he would shoot that. Then he would rewind the film, and then if he were over in this corner for that shot, then he'd move over and sit in the other corner. He'd put a new kind of tape on the camera, film it again, and the film you're going to see will show this. And you can see they're all Buster, right? Again, what it shows is he's a technician. He's interested in the technology of the motion picture camera and what kinds of manipulations are possible, because he's the conductor, right? As it turns out, he's going to also end up being the only person in the audience. Well, and then finally, what I've already implied is that Keaton's jokes and his technical interests also end up making him a metaphysician, a philosopher, an artist. Now, Keaton himself could never articulate his own ambitions in this way. If you said, Mr. Keaton, your vision of the absurd universe is more complex and rich than Jean-Paul Sartre's, as in fact it is, incidentally, he would laugh. He wouldn't even understand what you were talking about, not only because he'd never read Sartre since he died before. He was alive when Sartre was alive, actually, but he undoubtedly he did not. But the universe that he projects has a kind of content or a meaning that's a function of how intelligent he is about exploiting his medium and telling his stories, as if his jokes express a vision of life, a sense of experience. Now this, and of course, this is what you're looking at is sort of minor Keaton here, but it shows his technical interests. Well, so what I mean, so let me explain what I mean basically by the multiplicity principle. This process of accretion and complexity I've described, at a certain point, you get to a situation, you get to a point. Okay, let's shut it off, Greg, because I can see people are paying too much attention to this great artist and not to me, and I want to end it. At a certain point, you get to a point where what began as a gag or as a mere entertainment takes on a density or a texture that makes you think, wait a second. The vision of experience that's projected in this text is intrinsically interesting. That is to say, there's an understanding of life that's embedded in the story. When you reach the point where the text itself embodies some sort of understanding of life, and it's coherent, an understanding of life that's coherently presented, powerfully presented, what you're looking at is what I call art. You might just call it more intelligent entertainment, but this is a way of distinguishing between entertainment and art. In other words, there's a certain point at which entertainment becomes so complicated that it's more than mere entertainment. When does that occur? Well, one way to tell when it occurs is to watch for what I call the multiplicity principle. When events in the film play more than one function, do more than one job. When they forward the story but also declare for character. When they when they make you laugh but also express a vision of life, and at the same time are consistent with the character's psychological nature, that multiplicity, that density, that texture is what we associate with works of art. Right? A bad example would be, you're all familiar, I hope, with the kind of bad soap opera line in which a character comes in and says something like this: "Oh, hello, John, my long-lost brother who just got out of the insane asylum after 15 years of unfair misery." Right? What's wrong with that line? Why is that a stupid line, although we hear them all the time? What's wrong with it?
Excessive and awkward exposition.
It's very awkward exposition, but why is it so awkward? What makes it so awkward? Its intention is clear. It wants to present information to the audience. But in order to do that, what is it violated?
It ceases to be something that follows the nature of the character.
It ceases to be something that honors the character's nature. Exactly right. That's a very good answer. What's your name? Michael. Thank Michael. That's very good. And listen, what happened? Okay, I want to give information to the audience. In order to do that, I'll compromise the character's basic nature, because no sister talking to a brother would recount the brother's history to the brother, right? That just wouldn't happen, right? So in order to accomplish one task, the text has compromised itself on another task. But imagine a story in which this information emerges in dramatic ways. Two characters are talking, and Mary says to Joan, "Oh, Joan, my brother's coming back from the asylum." And she says, "Really? I didn't even know he was in the asylum." And Mary pulls back and says, "I don't know if I should tell you." Right? Okay, so we have a dramatic scene in which the information that the audience is supposed to have is presented in a way that maybe tells us something about Mary's nature and maybe tells us something about Joan's nature. That is multiplicity, right? That's what I mean by the multiplicity principle. You will see many, many instances of what I'm calling the multiplicity principle in Keaton's work, and you will especially see it in these astonishing, repeated sequences in which we see the, and I'm talking now in a way about the general, in which we see the Keaton hero who sort of is steadfast but also a muddler. He keeps doing the same things. They're not really likely to help him, and then he gets help from the outside. And what Keaton's jokes repeatedly depend upon the idea of accident in a certain way, and I'll come back to that finally in a second. So think about the multiplicity principle, the difference between entertainment and art. Again, this is a principle I'll come back to and try to illustrate with greater concreteness and greater leisure in later lectures, but I want you to be aware of these issues. So the general, made in 1927, can be seen as a kind of culminating text. I'm sorry I'm running over again. I won't do it after today, but what I've tried to do, please forgive me about this, but I'm very respectful of the fact that you guys have schedules, so I normally will not run over. But I've condensed into only 2 lectures what I normally do in 4. That's why I'm a little pressed and not quite saying as much as I had hoped to say here. So the general can be understood as a kind of culminating text in at least 2 ways. It's a culmination of Keaton's career. That is to say, the jokes and gags that are enacted in the film recall many earlier Keaton films. And the basic character of the general is the basic character of the Keaton hero, a steadfast, unremarkable young man who perseveres in the face of catastrophic difficulties with mostly comic expectations, very small expectations of success, who often muddles through almost despite himself. Right? Now, but it isn't merely, but I say almost despite himself. And this is where the complexity of Keaton's vision of life comes in, why I'm saying that Keaton moves from being merely a jokester or being merely a great entertainer to being an artist. His jokes embody an idea of what experience is like, and it's a very powerful, mordant, mature idea of experience, because what happens again and again in the small jokes, the sequence jokes in Keaton's work, especially in the general, and in the larger film, what happens again and again is an adventure in which a steadfast, relentless young hero does everything he can to accomplish his goal, and it's obvious that he's up against forces far beyond himself, that he could never, that there's an unbelievable mismatch between this minuscule, tiny figure and and his powers and the forces he's fighting against. There's one Keaton film called The Navigator, in which the Keaton character, even more than with the locomotive in the general, has to navigate an ocean liner. And he's alone on the ocean liner, and you see him running up and down into the engine room, back up to the bridge, running all over the ocean liner in great difficulties. There's a wonderful film, late film, made in 1928, just his last silent film, called Steamboat Bill Jr., in which he dramatizes an astonishing song, an astonishing hurricane, and a long extended sequence in which we see him trying to escape the hurricane, trying to contend against this natural force that's so gigantic. So the general is a culmination in the sense that it gives us another version, and the richest version so far of the adventures of this kind of Keaton hero. But what makes it sort of metaphysical or philosophically interesting is that what this joke repeatedly does, and what the structure of the whole film repeatedly says, is something like this: we make it through life. Mostly, it's a great Morton comic video. We get through life mostly not because of anything we've done, but because of accident. We live in a contingent universe, right? The idea of contingency is at the heart of Keaton's jokes. We could call them jokes about contingency. The word contingent is interesting. Remember, it means liable, but not certain to occur. It means possible, right? It means dependent upon, subject to, conditioned by, right? In law, you can say something. You can say that something that is contingent is dependent for its effect on something that may or may not occur, as in a contingent estate or legacy, right? In logic, the same thing. Dependent upon some condition or upon the truth of something else. Not true a priori, not necessary. So what Keaton's jokes constantly do is they show us two things. They show us a world in which human agency matters, because if this Schmendrick didn't keep, that's a Jewish word for schlemazel. It's a clown. If this Schmendrick did not keep on so steadfastly, he wouldn't survive. But his keeping on so steadfastly still wouldn't make him survive if there weren't the intervention of mere accident, stuff he has no control over. There's one magnificent moment in 1 week, for example, where, I think it's 1 week, where he's standing in a certain place and the house behind him falls down. And he happens just by accident to be standing so that by the open window, and the house falls so he doesn't get hurt. He used this joke more than once in other films because it's such a great one. But it's a perfect example of what I mean, a partial example of what I mean, because he's not responsible for the fact that he escaped. On the other hand, because he was trying to get away from difficulties, maybe he was in that particular position because of acts of his own. So what it says, what this joking vision says about the world is something that's true. We all love the idea that we've gotten to where we are by our own acts, by our own conscious control. The truth of the matter is that life is much more contingent than that. It's partly accident, it's partly luck, and something deeper than that. Keaton's vision of the universe is one which suggests that while the universe may screw you up sometimes, it won't always do that. That is to say, the universe in Keaton's world is not angry at us. It's indifferent to us. It doesn't give a damn about us. It's not aware of us. It's too big for us, right? You can't come away from Keaton's films without a simultaneous sense of the importance of human action, of human agency, but also of the inadequacy of human agency, of how contingent every experience, every adventure, every personality is. And that meaning, that idea of the world, is a profound one, I think. It tells so that even though Keaton is telling a joke, embedded in the joke is a kind of interpretation of life. And embedded in the film is a kind of interpretation of life. When you're looking at the general, I think you will see multiple examples of this kind of thing. Let me say one last thing. I haven't mentioned anything about the structure of the film. I'm a little out of order there. Watch how the film is structured. It's a much more complex variation on what I said about Lonedale Operator. The film begins with him going up the track, and then the second half of the film has him going back down the track. You may not be aware of it, but actually the film, in a certain sense, has its tail in its mouth. When it goes up the track, he has a series of adventures. When he comes back down, he has a series of adventures that, in a certain sense, replicate what's happened before. The film mirrors itself in a way, repeats itself. Watch it. It's an incredibly elegant structure. It's an and the elegance of the structure reminds us also in its own way, also reminds us of this principle of contingency that's at the heart of Keaton's vision of the world. Let me conclude by reminding you again of what I said earlier. When I call Keaton a philosopher and a metaphysician and a wise person about the world, I do not at all mean to suggest that if you asked Keaton to explain how he thought about the world, he could do this. That's the job of professors and literary and film critics, right? What I'm saying to you is that Keaton, like many great artists, had an intuitive understanding of the world, which he expressed with greater and greater complexity in the medium of the cinema. And in the general, we have what is ultimately a culminating instance of that. One last point about the film as a culminating example. It's not just a culmination of Keaton's career. It's a culmination of silent film as a whole. Keaton would have expected his audience to recognize the degree to which this film was a parody or a mockery of famous historical films made by D.W. Griffith. It puts down the pretentiousness and the martial valor that's celebrated in so many of the historical spectacles that Griffith and other serious directors were making at the time. And it also goes back in a certain way to the very roots of film. What was the very first narrative film? Or one of the very first. Also a film about a train robbery, right? Called The Great Train Robbery. Well, this is about a train robbery too. And who is the central character in this film? Really, a train is the central object, the central, more interesting in some ways than the character himself. And there are many other ways in which the particular features of the general allude to and in some sense summarize the history of silent film. And all of the original audience coming to see the general would have been, of course, alert to these connections, would have been literate in these connections, wouldn't have needed footnotes or professors to tell them about it, because they would have lived through the history. They would have lived through the history of the previous 20 years. They would have seen other Keaton films. They would have seen D.W. Griffith. They would have the history of the medium of movies in their heads when they sat down to watch the general. So that's another way in which the general is a profoundly culminating text. I'm sorry I ran over. I will not do it hereafter.